Good morning to you. It is a wonderful Thursday morning, the 6th of March, and we are marching right along in our tracking through the story of the letter to the Christian Hebrews as the writer tracks the idea of stick to itiveness. Stick with the program, stick with God, stick to Christ the King. Don't let unbelief overtake you. In the early 90s, there were two conventions for a democratic South Africa, and it was called CODESA 1, followed by CODESA 2. And we were all quite excited about this negotiation that was happening. CODESA 1 went down, and then CODESA 2 starts up and ends in a deadlock. And I well remember those days how we all froze because we thought the inevitable would happen in South Africa. A bloody revolution could ensue. Well, all the liberation movements, including the ANC, were deadlocked around a number of issues. While the ground foundational issues were talked about and set in CODESA 1, CODESA 2 was where the trouble was. The Inkatha Freedom Party refused to attend the second party because of their protest of what they regarded a disregard for the Zulu king, King Goodwill Zwelithini, and his role as a political leader. So for 2 months, we froze and just thought, this is it. We will go the way of all the world, all the African countries. And of course, the National Party was arguing for a non-racial interim government. ANC wanted an interim uh, uh, government that would last for not more than 18 months. And but the situation was deadlocked. And it took some encouragement and coercion from the US, who urged President F.W. de Klerk and the ANC leader Nelson Mandela to resume negotiations to resolve this crisis. And it took the involvement of technical experts to assist in the negotiation process, which eventually got on track. And here we are sitting 30 years into what that negotiation produced. It is interesting to notice how that Christ, the mediating king, the one who mediates, is the one who gives newness, freshness, and closeness. Because in this section of the scriptures in Hebrews chapter 8, starting in verse number 6, the covenant mediating Christ is superior in his provision for proximal knowledge of his grace, close proximity, access, knowledge of his grace. He is the mediating Christ, and he's superior in his provision because that's what he does. He provides access, and you're going to see from the details given in the story now how that the story flows toward that person, the covenant mediating Christ. He's no subby. He's the superordinate one, the Son of God. He's the superordinate walk in verse 5 of chapter 1 all the way to chapter 10, verse 18, and then 10:19 to chapter 13. He is the superordinate way. And how he gets there is very, very crucial because the writer explains through a lot of detail, and almost detail that bores. It just gets us bored as non-Hebrew speakers and ethnicities with the detail here. But you see, he's explaining line by line in the stories, going through the scaffolding of this unfolding story to show that Christ is it. And he starts out in verse number 6 by tracking this idea that there was a need for a new pact, a new covenant, because the ministry which Christ attained is superior, far superior to that of any earthly priest, because he was the go-between of a superior pact, a superior covenant, which was based upon and drawn on better promises, which was not contingent on Israel's obedience, but contingent on his word, to make the law of God something which would be internalized, and for them to be in close relationship with him, that all will know him as gracious, thus causing the Mosaic covenant, the old dated covenant, obsolete and disappearing. Now, that's a mouthful, but it was so important for the writer to track these details for these Christian Hebrews, because they come out of a culture, out of an ethnic group that was soaked in the Old Testament, in the ways of the law. And now, because they were in a hot spot or getting into difficult situations because of persecution, their thoughts gravitate back to the old. Something similar to what happened in the wilderness wanderings. It was very soon as they come across dry ground through the Red Sea that the first question they ask as they get into the desert, the first question is, what shall we then eat? And of course, God provides. But in raising the question, they suggest, it will be cool to go back to Egypt. We had onions and leeks, and we had flesh pots. Let's go back because our appetite, our taste buds are yearning for the old, inferior, almost obsolete ways. Because God was leading them into something new. But it would come by faith. It would come through their ultimate care for what was really real. And verse 6 starts out of chapter 8, and it says, but as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is so much more excellent. Notice the terms. Much more excellent. Not just excellent, not just more excellent, but much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better. Add that on top of much more excellent. Add the word better. Since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, that's the Mosaic law, the Mosaic covenant, the pact between God and Israel. If it had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second covenant. The writer affirms that if the first covenant had not been irreproachable, then there would be no occasion sought for a second. Now, it's very interesting and very important to realize that the 613 laws, and that's the count, that's a conservative account, by my great admiration for Moses Maimonides, a rabbi par excellence. Interesting that his name was Moses as well. Maimonides. There was none like Moses than the one who rises as the second Moses. Moses Maimonides. His conservative count of the laws in the Old Testament was 613. And it's beautiful to just track how he does the count. Many works have been produced, and his count of 613 has been quoted across the centuries. 613 laws regulating the life of the Hebrew people. It really functioned as a constitution as we negotiated the way forward through the Codesa conferences to a better future for all in South Africa. So this covenant was given to guide and to guard the life of the people called the Hebrews. And so in verse 6 and 7, there was a need for a new pact because something was faulty with the first one. Now we're just going to touch on where the faultiness lay. Because now, starting in verse number 8, verse 8 to verse 12, is going to track where the fault line was. There was a need for a new pact in this section of the story, going from verse 6 to verse 7. And now the first party found a problem with the pact that would be resolved by the new pact. Verse 8 says, "For he, God, finds fault with the pact." Yes, in a sense, the pact. But it was with the people involved in the pact. He finds fault with them. Who's the antecedent of them? The Hebrew people. The people of God in the Old Testament. And here the writer is using the example of their defection in the wilderness. We tracked in a previous episode how that about 1.2 million people drop in the desert across a 38-year window. If you were to calculate that over the decades and over the years, over the weeks, over the months, and over the days, you end up with something like 87 funerals per day, which is startling stuff. But because unbelief creeps into their world, into their minds, into their hearts, and infects them, their carcasses drop in the wilderness. So the problem wasn't with the pact per se, or only. It was more with the people who could not keep it. And because of Jesus Christ coming onto the scene, you are going to see why there is a need for a new pact. And now the writer is going to quote in verse 8 an Old Testament quotation. He says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It is new, qualitatively new. It's going to be established just not with the two southern tribes. It will be established with the 10 northern tribes as well. Because remember, the 10 northern tribes go into captivity. They go into Assyrian captivity. And here the text quoting Jeremiah 31 to 33. I will establish something new, something fresh. Now, newness and freshness is the singular thing that we find attractive in life. Who likes milk that goes sour because of the time stamp that was not honored? None of us like oldness. We may gravitate towards it because it provides certain security for us. But there's something about that which is old that can become nauseating. And so this morning, as we close out our time, I want to fire the question: what newness and freshness and attunement are you experiencing in your walk with God today? For us as believers, and you're going to notice in the text in the unfolding episodes, he enacts something new, something fresh, something that will get us attuned to God, attuned to the agent who is the transcendent agent of our lives. God, our Heavenly Father, brings us into close proximity to Himself through something new, a pact, a compact, a covenant that is new, fresh, and provides proximity, closeness. None of us like to be far, living very far from our workspace and our workplace, and far from our children, and far from our grandchildren, and far from those we love. Our hearts yearn for something that is close. Now, if you're not experiencing that, then ask yourself the question this morning: why not? Why ain't I experiencing this newness and freshness that verse 8 is going to talk in a detailed way into in this section of the story? Because newness and freshness and proximity is what is intoxicating. It draws us in. Unless you are reaching for the bench and your back is bent, the force of gravity is taking its and having its impact upon your body because you're growing older, like many of us. If that's your posture, well, you're not opting for what is best. Be like a Caleb at 85 when he says to Moses, I want you to give me the hills of the Anakim because I'm looking at a new chapter, a new phase of life that is new and fresh. As you move forward with great expectation into this Thursday morning, move with eager anticipation for what God is about to do next in your life. Live it on the balls of your feet as you eagerly anticipate what He's about to do. Trust that you would have a good, refreshing day. May God bless you, and goodbye for now.